All right, here we go. We ready for the shit show again? This guy.
I may have to cut you off if we see the committee get underway, but the question is, will we hear new information? We all saw in plain sight.
We're not going to hear anything new.
On January 6th.
It's all a bunch of lies.
Some of this, I think, will be new to most of us. For example, I've been digging into what the committee has revealed through their depositions, and what our great team at the Washington Post has reported.
Sorry, I'm trying to make the size right for you guys.
Intently, it's new. For example, Greg Jacob and his role being in the room with Pence when he was getting pressured by these Trump lawyers, as James said, even President Trump himself.
There we go.
One thing the committee has shared is that during the attack, Jacob was on the receiving end of a fiery email from Eastman, that Trump lawyer is pushing all these fraud claims and accusing Pence of causing the attack for not rejecting the electoral result votes. And Jacob has said and testified Pence team faced a barrage of
all right, here they go. They're going to start it now, guys.
What they say. There's the chair, and next to him is Congressman Aguilar. Let's go live now to the committee.
The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material represented during today's hearing. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is almost no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president. No idea more un-American. I agree with that, which is unusual because former Vice President Mike Pence and I don't agree on much. These are his words, spoken a few months ago about Donald Trump's attempt to pressure the former vice president, pressure him into going along with an unlawful and unconstitutional scheme to overturn the 2020 election and give Donald Trump the fruits of that pressure campaign. But what does
there you go, you big baby.
The Vice President of the United States even have to do with a presidential election? The Constitution says that the Vice President of the United States oversees the process of counting the Electoral College votes, a process that took place on January 6, 2021. Donald Trump wanted Mike Pence to do something no other vice president has ever done. The former president wanted Pence to reject the votes and either declare Trump the winner or send the votes back to the states to be counted again.
What's wrong with that?
Mike Pence said no. He resisted the pressure. He knew it was illegal. He knew it was wrong.
It's not illegal to send the votes back.
Pence's courage on January 6th. Our democracy came dangerously close to catastrophe. That courage put him in tremendous danger. When Mike Pence made it clear that he wouldn't give in to Donald Trump's scheme, Donald Trump turned the mob on him. A mob that was chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." A mob that had built a hang-stood Donald Trump scheme and the violence of January 6th. But the danger hasn't receded.
Hey, Willow.
Led by my colleague, Mr. Aguilar.
Yeah, that's the shit show I'm talking about.
Facts for the American people. But first, I'll recognize my colleague from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for any opening statement.
They keep bringing this is their token Republican.
Thank you very much,
the
Mr.
token
Chairman.
Republican. This dumb chick.
Let me take just a few minutes today to put the topic of our hearing in broader context. In our last hearing, we heard unequivocal testimony that President Trump was told his election fraud allegations were complete nonsense. We heard this from members of the Trump campaign. We heard this from President Trump's campaign lawyers. We heard this from President Trump's former Attorney General, Bill Barr. We heard this from President Trump's former acting Attorney General, Jeff Rosen. And we heard this from President Trump's former acting Deputy Attorney General, Richard Donahue. We heard from members of President Trump's White House staff as well. Today, we're focusing on President Trump's relentless effort to pressure Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes on January 6th.
Right, Willow?
Here again is how the former vice president phrased it.
I mean, look who her dad is.
Before the Federalist U.S. society.
shot
a
somebody
group of
with a
conservative
shotgun.
Lawyers.
What's up, Hope? If anybody wants to
This
join
week,
me in Discord, they can.
that President Trump said I had to return the election. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone. And frankly, there is no idea more un-American than
The Vice
He wasn't
President's
trying to get you to
view is not
overturn
just
him.
wrong hearing, but please consider these 2 points.
And it's not
First,
unconstitutional.
President Trump was told repeatedly that Mike Pence lacked the constitutional and legal authority to do what President Trump was demanding he do. This is testimony from Mark Short, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, who served in the Trump administration in multiple positions over 4 years.
But just to pick up on that, Mr. Short, is these issues to the president, not just to the world through a dear colleague letter, but directly to President Trump.
Many times.
And he'd been consistent in conveying his position to the president.
Very consistent.
Okay.
But President Trump plotted with a lawyer named John Eastman to pressure Pence to do so anyway. As the federal court has explained, quote, based on the evidence conspired to, did President Trump know?
This chick, right?
When exactly did President Trump know that it would be illegal for Mike Pence to refuse to count
She's just a
electoral
token
votes?
Republican is all she is.
Here is one sample of testimony given by one of the witnesses before
Right?
us today, the Vice President's General Counsel.
And they're only showing one side. They're not showing.
Did
They
John
only show you what they want to show
ever
you. That's why all this
admit-
stuff is cut up.
Or, in front of
I
the
want to know
president,
about Ray Epps. Where's Ray
that
Epps?
his proposal would violate.
Yeah, where's his interview?
Yeah.
Or like
Yeah,
when they,
where's his proposition?
what about all the Proud Boys they interviewed? They didn't show.
That was
They showed
January 4th,
one clip of like
2 days
5
before
seconds
the
of
attack
Noble
on
Beard.
Congress.
Nobody else,
A second
Right.
point.
because it doesn't go for
Well,
their
Please
narrative.
listen to testimony
Exactly,
today
that's
about
what I was
all
gonna
of the
say.
ways
Goes
that
against their
President
narrative.
Trump attempted to pressure Vice President Pence.
They're about as convincing
including
as,
Donald
trying to
Trump's
sell
tweet
ice to an
at
Eskimo.
2:24 p.m. condemning
Yeah, right.
Vice President Mike Pence.
Oh,
I don't know. These
President
Democrats
Trump
probably would be
already
pretty good at
knew
doing
a
that, though.
violent riot was underway
Oh, shit.
at the Capitol. In future
This
hearings,
just- this
you
whole
will hear
thing
from
just makes me so
witnesses
damn mad.
who were present inside
Oh, yeah.
the White House.
It's a
who were
joke.
present inside the West Wing.
It's
on
because
that
they're
day.
worried they're going to lose the election
But
again.
today we focus on the earnest efforts of Mike
And
Pence,
key word I said
who is
again.
determined to abide by his
They're
oath
gonna
of
lose
office.
so bad.
As Vice President
Yeah.
Pence prepared a
I
statement
hope it
on
sets him
January
back 50,
5th
60
and 6th,
years.
I hope so too.
explained that he could not
Oh, you're sharing
The vice
something.
president had said this may be the
Yeah,
most
I
important
know.
thing I
What's
ever
up,
I'm doing
Eric?
something wrong.
This being the statement, and he really wanted to make sure that it was just so.
You will hear today that President Trump's White House counsel believed that the Vice President did exactly the right
Hope,
thing on
I'll
January
take a-
6th, as did others in the White House,
I'll take a French
as
dip.
did Fox News host Sean
There we
Hannity.
go. Sorry.
Vice
You're good.
President Pence understood that his oath of office was more important than his loyalty to Donald Trump. He did his duty.
Can I
President
share
Trump
some with you?
unequivocally
Sure.
did not.
Deeds
Thank
in
you,
it.
Mr. Chairman.
Sorry.
I yield back.
Trade. Has
Without
his first
objection,
race
I
tonight.
recognize the gentleman
Oh, does he?
from California,
Nice.
Mr.
I'm not-
Aguilar,
I'm not
for
going.
an opening statement.
Yeah, you're scared?
A little.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I bet.
Well, look
Today
what
we
happened the
intend to
last
show
time.
The American
Yeah.
people that January 6th was
Let's see what
not
this guy has to
an
say.
isolated incident. In the weeks culminating before, it was a legal scheme and deception. Movie's most fundamental civic tradition, peaceful
Unbelievable.
transfer of power.
French dip is a
President
roast beef
latched on
sandwich
to a
with the
dangerous
dipping
theory
sausage.
happened when the President of the United States weaponized this theory. The Capitol was overrun. Police officers lost their lives. The effect of Donald Trump's words and actions. I want to warn our audience that the video contains explicit content.
Oh no, explicit content. I think they don't even mention roast. I don't know if they have a French dip at Arby's.
Very disappointed in you, I will tell you right now.
Hope is trying to buy me food.
I'm hearing that Pence,
Is she?
I heard
Bless
that
her
Pence
heart.
just caved.
He's so sweet.
Is that true?
Right?
I'm hearing reports that Pence caved. I'm telling you, if Pence caved, we're gonna drag motherfuckers through the streets.
That's just people being mad and
Politicians
saying
are gonna
words.
get fucking drugged through the streets.
I guess the hope is that there's such a show of force here.
I missed it too. I'm looking at the video looking for my stuff.
Oh.
The chant, and it's
Point where President Trump's most radical supporters led a violent attack on the Capitol.
All right, we're gonna have to show Hope what a French dip is. You know what a French dip is, right, Willow?
Oh, you bet.
Sandwich in there.
That the vice president
On a
can
hoagie
choose
roll.
Yeah.
who the next president can be. You'll hear about how the vice president, the White House counsel, and others told Donald Trump that the vice president had no such authority. But President Trump would not listen. Your campaign that built there was a violent mob at the Capitol when he tweeted at 2:24 p.m. that the
Hoagie
vice
sub,
president
kind of same
did not
thing.
have the quote courage to do what needed to be done. Let me be clear. Vice President Pence did the right thing that day. He stayed
In
true
your
to his
eyes,
oath.
with the votes, he could have gone and said,
Thank
"I
you,
don't
Mr.
certify."
Aguilar.
That's
We're
all they're
honored
talking
to have
about.
two distinguished witnesses who advised Vice President regarding his role on January 6th. Judge J. Michael Ludick is one of the leading conservative legal thinkers in the country. He served in administrations of President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush.
Speaking of Reagan, did you hear they let out his the guy who attempted to kill him?
U.S. Court of Appeals
Yes.
for the Fourth Circuit, where he served
Yeah, he
from
got
1991
honorary
to 2006.
Yeah.
parole.
Vice President does not have
Yeah.
I remember it
power
well.
to
I mean,
select the next
John Hinckley.
president of the United
I remember
States.
it well.
He's also written
I don't. I was only like 5 years
that
old.
contrary theory
Yeah,
espoused
it
by
was-
one of
it
his
was-
own former
Reagan was
law
my
clerks
hero
was,
back then.
quote,
He was the first
incorrect.
president I...
Greg Jacob was counsel vice president in the joint session of Congress of historical practice.
People in
because
chat
he
for this.
lived through it.
I'm
I'll
on
swear
an
in
extended
with
bread,
the whole
and
truth.
the trailer
You swear
tags were
or
due in
affirm
February,
under
and I
penalty of
forgot to do them.
Not
But
good.
it's only like
testimony
one
you're
of
about to
5
give
trailers that I have, so
whole truth and
it's not
nothing
like
but the
I...
truth. So help me
Right.
God.
It's the only thing, plus
Thank
3
you.
vehicles and a motorhome, so it's the only thing that I overdid.
Thank you. President
Uh-huh.
Trump did not like
It's my
the
first
outcome.
one, and
He
it
did
was the first
everything
ones
he could
after
to
COVID
change the
opened
result
back
of
up.
the election.
Yeah.
He tried litigation.
Wow.
62
I really
cases,
enjoyed it.
in fact,
Good.
and that failed.
I think everybody should do
He
it
tried
once.
to pressure state legislatures to
course.
reverse the results of
I
the
should always try
election
something
in
once,
their
at least.
states, but they
Yeah,
refused.
you know, everybody says
He
it's so
tried to
horrible, but
enlist the Department
I
of
think
Justice
having a
in his
jury of their
efforts
peers
to
is very,
overturn
very
election
important.
results.
Oh,
In
yeah.
this case, the guy
But
was we
officials
found him
leading the
innocent, so
department
Yeah.
thank God,
refused to
you know.
comply.
Yeah. I like watching court
So
stuff. So.
eventually, he latched on to a completely nonsensical and anti-democratic theory that one
Nonsensical.
man, his own vice president,
You
could
just don't want us to
determine the
believe your guys'
outcome
lies.
of the election. He wanted the vice
I said that wrong.
president
They want us to believe their lies.
unilaterally
They want
select
us to believe.
the president American experience.
Excuse me. Sorry.
How president of the
God,
United
what's the
States.
dramatics?
How many
Mr.
theories did
Jacob,
you liberals come up with
How
lately?
did this theory first come
Just
to
since,
your attention?
what, 6 a.m.?
Turn on your mic, bro.
The first time that I had a conversation with her seven,
You're up there and you're afraid to say the wrong thing, so you're gonna. Oh, I'm not.
he told me that he had been first elected to Congress in 2000, and that one of his
I'm
earliest
excited
memories
for
as a
August.
congressman was sitting in.
Yeah. When I go to
on
my
the
court trial
2001
for Rufio and them,
certification objections that had been
well,
raised
you
in
know.
Florida.
if they arrest me,
And he asked
I told
me,
Gra to give contact you right
mechanically,
away so you can get
how
Donnie.
does this work?
Oh, wow.
That actually there aren't rules that govern the joint sentence long.
Look at that lady in
and
the
an
in the
Electoral
blonde
Count
hair.
Act
She
that
just
had been
has a
passed in
nonstop
1987.
frown. That's how she looks. That's how
I
she
told
looks
the
every day,
Vice President
probably.
that I could put a memo together for him over.
What do they have to be happy about? They're so miserable right now. It makes me just
So,
smile.
Mr. Jacob, when you looked
Yeah.
at this theory,
They are
what
so
did you
miserable.
conclude?
They know what's coming.
They chose the wrong candidate.
We concluded
Oh,
that
I tell you.
what you have was
I
that there
think
the
the
tyranny of George
consequences.
III
Yeah.
would ever have put
That's just my...
one person.
All I can say is if he
particularly not a
wins the
person
next
who had
election
direct
again, if he
interest
runs
in the
again,
outcome,
there's
because they
no
were
way.
on the ticket for the election
There's no way.
in a role to have decisive
We're the laughing stock.
impact on the outcome.
Inconceivable.
And our review of
Inconceivable.
text,
Right on. We got Kate, the Irish
history,
lady, coming in.
and frankly, just common sense, justifiable basis to conclude
Hey, Kate.
that the vice president has
today about this critical election.
Judge Ludick statement earlier today, which I urge all Americans to read. And I'd like to ask you, Judge, about one of the sentences in your statement and ask if you could explain to us
I need a big old stamp in that sound, boom, and just stamp right on her head, Rhino.
Had the Vice President of the United States obeyed the President of the United States, America would immediately have been plunged into what would have been tantamount to a revolution within a paralyzing constitutional crisis. Could you elaborate on that for us, Judge?
Of course. How you doing today, Kate?
I'm doing well. Can we even call her a Republican? Like, I don't feel like we can even call her a Republican.
Yeah, probably not.
Like, she voted on gun control in favor of it. She's voted in favor of, quote, women's rights, which is really just abortion. She was willing to get rid of the Hyde Amendment. She was willing to sign on to the $6 trillion, thankfully Manchin stopped that bill. It's
concept
like every single value that you project
in America
is a Democrat value, but yet you sit here and you say, I'm a Republican.
Thus, as I interpret your question, truth of these
Did she get primary?
United States.
Oh, I didn't even look up yet. Let me look it up.
Which we call America.
Let me look up her results.
The foundational truth is the rule of law. That foundational truth is, for the United States of America, the profound truth. But it's not merely the profound truth for the United States. It's also the simple truth, the simple foundational truth of the American Republic. Thus, in my view, the hearings being conducted by this
that Wyoming has
the rule of law.
Poll numbers are dismal. I just looked at the poll numbers, and her polling is like 21%, and the other Republican is getting 59%.
Yeah. Even
Where's the 21% people voting for Liz Cheney? Point me in their direction.
It's the people that don't want to watch the news.
That foundational rule of law.
They just see the name Cheney and say, "Oh, we should vote for her. Her dad was
over there in Wyoming."
Right? He's practiced this speech.
That you asked.
This is a practice
Madam
speech.
Vice Chair.
You can tell.
I believe that had Vice President Pence obeyed the orders from his president and the President of the United States of America during the joint session of the Congress of the
What cracks me up is these to overturn the election to allow the 10 states that had sent letters, allegations, and
lost the Electoral College vote, as
they
well as
finished their
the
investigations, nothing came of it.
popular vote
America would have
in the
had
2020
more faith
presidential election.
in our voting and more faith in our Congress and in our Senate, but because
that declaration
of the fact that investigations just
would have been tantamount would
Yeah.
have been.
You really did it for 15 minutes.
That's why you
Thank you very much, Judge,
Yeah.
for your solemn attention
But I
to
mean,
these issues.
most of these people that are testifying are afraid to say what they really think, in my opinion.
We're going to describe and discuss in detail what happened.
Like on the other trials, did you notice the lawyers were giving them cues of what to say and what not to say?
Of some of the actions taken.
I mean, that's their job.
By a gentleman named Kenneth Cheeseborough
all over again.
On December 14th. Actually, the day before they met, Kenneth Cheeseborough sent a memo to Rudy Giuliani, the president's lead outside counsel. Mr. Cheeseborough wrote to Mayor Giuliani that the vice president is charged with, quote, making judgments about what to do if there are conflicting votes, close quote. Mr. should not count the Biden claim them sit by the state and a group of fake
Trump
electors.
supporters.
This document was ordered to be produced to the Select Committee
Carla?
session of Congress. Eastman was at the time a law professor at Chapman University Law School. He prepared a memo outlining the nonsensical theory that the vice president could decide the outcome of the election at the joint session of Congress
That's not
on
what
January
they're
6th.
trying to do, like Kate said earlier.
11 states have transmitted those so-called dual slates of the 2020 election. Mr. Jacob, were there in fact dual slates of electors from 7 states?
No, there were not.
And just a few days scenarios. He knew the outcome real. The Biden electors, ultimately, this was for 19, the fake electors had, end quote, because they did not have a certification from their states. Judge Ludig, did the Trump electors
whatsoever in either ever state official in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I did notice in the passage from Mr. Eastman's memorandum, and I took a note on it, in that historical Mr.
I
Eastman
almost
was
can't even
referring
watch this
to
anymore.
when he said that there was historical precedent for doing so. He was incorrect. That even as mere historical precedent, the possibility of the Vice President of the United States be certified to the Congress pursuant to the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I would
pursuing that issue in more depth, and now I'd like to yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, and Staff Counsel, Mr. John Wood, for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're fortunate to have a
This guy looks like
bipartisan
a
staff.
sleazeball, doesn't he?
Senior Investigative Counsel John Wood previously served as United States Attorney in Missouri under President George W. Bush. He and I will share today's lines of questioning. Mr. Wood?
Nothing so far, Cajun, just a bunch of lies like...
at my disposal either Mr. Eastman's first, but I don't. But Mr. Eastman's analysis.
And Judge, I can read to you and to the audience, I think what was a really key passage from your very insightful analysis when you wrote, I believed that Professor Eastman was incorrect at every turn of the analysis in his January 2nd memorandum, beginning with his claim that there were legitimate competing slates of electors presented from 7 states. And you've already addressed that issue. But your next sentence said, continuing to his conclusion that the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from the 7 states from which competing slates were allegedly presented. So what was your basis for concluding that Dr. Eastman was incorrect in his conclusion that the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from these disputed states?
I understand. As I previously stated in response to Congresswoman
Can't
Cheney,
find it.
There was no basis in the Constitution or laws of the United States at all for the theory espoused by Mr. Eastman. At all. None. With all respect to my co-panelist, he said, I believe in partial response to one of the Select Committee's questions, that the single sentence in the 12th Amendment was, he thought, inartfully written. That single sentence is not inartfully written. It was pristine clear that the President of the Senate,
See how closely this guy's thinking about how to say his words? He's so afraid to say the wrong thing.
President of the United States, had little substantive constitutional authority, if any, at all. The 12th Amendment, the single sentence that Mr. Jacob refers to,
Right back.
says in substance that
This is him.
following the transmission of the certificates to the Congress of the United States and under the Electoral Count Act of 1887, the Archivist of the United States, that the presiding officer shall open the certificates of the United States in joint. Vice President himself shall count the electoral votes. It clearly shall then be counted. Of 1887, the simple words of the 12th Amendment, in order to construct for the country a process for the counting of the sacred process for the counting of the electoral institution, nor even the 12th Amendment had done.
So you want
Electoral Count Act turmoil beginning as 1800. So it wasn't for almost 100 years later, a piece of legislation is not only a work in progress for the country, but at this moment in history, an important work in progress that needs to take place. That was long-winded, I understand.
Well, Judge Ludig, at the risk of oversimplifying for the non-lawyers who are watching, is it fair to say that the 12th Amendment basically says two things happen?
I would not want that to be my testimony before the Congress of the United States. The language of the 12th Amendment is that simple.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Jacob, I have a question for you. I believe during your deposition before this committee, you said something to the effect of you'd read every word written about the 12th Amendment, the Electoral Count Act, and historical practice. I know in response to the chairman's earlier question, you gave your bottom line conclusion, but can you tell us a little bit about the process that you and your colleagues went through of researching this issue and what conclusion you came to after your thorough research?
So,
how thorough is the research? What's up, anyone?
You, as a lawyer who's analyzing a constitutional provision, you start with the constitutional text, you go to structure, you go to history. So we started with the text. We did not think that the text was quite as unambiguous as Judge Ludig indicated. In part, we had a constitutional crisis in 1876 because in that year, multiple slates of electors were certified by multiple slates. And when it came time to count those votes, the antecedent question of which ones had to be answered. That required the appointment of an independent commission. That commission had to resolve that question, and the purpose of the Electoral Count Act of 1887 had been to resolve those latent ambiguities. Now, I'm in complete agreement with Judge Ludig. It is unambiguous that the Vice President does not have the authority to reject electors. There is no suggestion of any kind that it does. There is no mention of rejecting or objecting to electors anywhere in the 12th Amendment. And so the notion that the Vice President could do that certainly is not in the text. But the problem that we had and that John Eastman raised in our discussions was we had all seen that in Congress in 2000, in 2004, in 2016, there had been objections raised to various states. And those had even been debated in 2004. And so here you have an amendment that says nothing about objecting or rejecting, and yet we did have some recent practice of that happening within the terms of the Electoral Count Act. So we started with that text, and I recall in my discussion with the Vice President, he said, I can't wait to go to heaven and meet the framers and tell them the work that you did in putting together our Constitution is a... So then we went to, there's just no way that the framers of the Constitution, who divided power and authority, who separated it out, who had broken away from George III.
You guys want to see what Donald J. Trump thinks about this whole session? He's just sleeping.
There was no way that they would have put in the hands of one person to history. We examined every single electoral vote count that had happened in Congress since the beginning of the country. We examined the Electoral Count Act. We examined practice under the Electoral Count Act. And critically, no vice president in 230 years of history had ever claimed to have that kind of authority, hadn't claimed authority to reject electoral votes, had not claimed authority to return electoral votes back to the states. In the entire history of the United States, not once had a joint session ever returned electoral votes back to the states to be counted. And in the crisis of 1876, Justice Bradley of the United States Supreme Court, who supplied the decisive final vote on that commission, had specifically looked at that question and said, first, the Vice President clearly doesn't have authority to decide anything. With Mr. Eastman was, if you were right, don't you think Al Gore might have liked to have known in 2000 that he had authority to just declare himself President of the United States? Did you think that the Democrat lawyers just didn't think of this very obvious quirk that he could use to do that? And of course, he acknowledged Al Gore did not and should not have had that authority at that point in time. But so text, structure, history, I think what we had was some ambiguous text that common sense and structure would tell you the answer cannot possibly be that the Vice President has that authority. As the committee already played the Vice President's remarks, there is almost no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person would choose the American president. And then unbroken historical practice for 230 years that the Vice President did not have such an authority.
Thank you. I reserve the remainder of my time.
Mr. Jacob, you weren't the only one who knew that the legal theory was wrong, though. Here's what various advisors to the president thought about that theory.
You've been clear repeatedly with Mr. Meadows about you and the Vice President having a different view about his authority on January 6th.
I believe I had.
Did Mr. Meadows ever explicitly or tacitly?
I believe that Mark did agree.
What makes you say that?
I believe that's what he told me.
He believes.
But as I mentioned, I think Mark had told so many people so many different things that it was not something that I would necessarily accept as, okay, well, that means that's resolved.
I see. Tell me more what he told you on this topic.
Well, I think it was that, the Vice President doesn't have any broader role. And I think he was understanding of that.
So despite the fact that he may have said other things to the President or others, to you, he said he understands the Vice President has no role.
Yes.
Okay. Did he say that to you several times?
A couple times.
Mm-hmm. Before January 6th?
Yes.
the way it was communicated to me was that Pat Cipollone thought the idea was nutty.
This is just a joke, guys. That's all this
at one
is.
point confronted Eastman basically with the same sentiment.
Pat expressed his admiration for the vice president's actions on the day of the 6th and said that he concurred with the legal analysis that our team had put together to reach that point.
It made no sense to me that in all the protections that were built into the Constitution for a president to get elected and steps that had to be taken, that the power to choose the next president would be sitting with the vice president.
Do you know if Mr. Clark or Mr.
This guy with the freaking
Morgan
face mask on
thought about that, Mr. Eastman's advice?
Yeah, they thought he was crazy.
He's in a room all by himself, but
an
he needs a
opinion
face
on
mask.
whether they thought the vice president had the power that John Eastman said he did.
I know for a fact I heard both say that his theory was crazy, that there was no validity to it in any way, shape, or form.
And did they express that before January 6th?
Yes.
To whom?
I think anyone who would listen.
Okay, what were your prior interactions with Eastman?
He described for me what he thought the ambiguity was in the statute, and he was walking through it at that time. And I said, hold on a second, I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that you believe the vice president, acting as president of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next president of the United States? And he said, yes. And I said, are you out of your effing mind? Right? And that was pretty blunt. I said, you're completely crazy. I said, you're going to turn around and tell 78 plus million people in this country that your theory is this is how you're going to invalidate their votes because you think the election was stolen. And I said, they're not going to tolerate that. I said, you're going to cause riots in the streets.
It's very pathetic, right?
And he said, words to the effect of, there's been...
Baseball bat that says justice.
In fact, there was a risk that the lawyers in the White House counsel's office would resign. For example, Fox News host Sean Hannity expressed concern that the entire White House counsel's office could quit. As you can see from these texts, Mr. Hannity wrote to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows that, quote, "We can't lose the entire White House counsel's office. I do not see January 6th happening the way he is being told." A few days later, on January 5th, Mr. Hannity wrote to Mr. Meadows that, quote, "I'm very worried the next 48 hours. Pence pressure, White House counsel will leave." While Sean Hannity was apparently very concerned about the possibility that the White House counsel would resign in protest of the president's effort to force the vice president to violate the Constitution, some others close to the president were more dismissive of the White House counsel's position regarding the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone.
Of instances where Pat Cipollone threatened to resign.
I kind of, like I said, my interest at that time was on trying to get as many pardons done. And I know that, he was always, him and the team were always saying, oh, we're going to resign. We're not going to be here if this happens, if that happens. So I kind of took it up to just be whining, to be honest with you.
So he's a whiner.
The president's own lead outside counsel, Rudy Giuliani, also seemed to concede that the vice president did not have the authority to decide the outcome of the election. Giuliani on the morning of the 6th.
The morning of January 6th, I think he called me out of the blue, right? And I was like getting dressed. I don't know if it's Eastman's theory analysis, and you're probably right. I think he thought when we're done that it would be something he'd have to consider if he was sitting on the bench.
That's all right, Kate. Thank you. There's not much to talk about. These guys are just constantly lying.
The argument long term.
They're only showing what they want to show.
Of course, on January 6th,
I'm trying to get stuff done right now too.
The exact opposite. Here's Mayor Giuliani's speech at the Ellipse rally on January 6th.
We're here just very briefly to make a very important 2 points. Number one, every single thing that has been outlined as the plan for today is perfectly legal. I have Professor Eastman here with me to say a few words about that. He's one of the preeminent constitutional scholars in the United States. It is perfectly appropriate, Evan, that the Vice President can cast it aside, and he can do what a president called Jefferson did when he was Vice President. He can decide on the validity of these crooked ballots.
Somebody might be here.
Or he can send it back to the legislature.
And here's what Dr. Eastman said in his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government.
Exactly. He didn't tell him to change the election. He said, let us look into this. It's a big difference.
Even Dr. Eastman knew his theory didn't hold water. Mr. Jacob, you discussed and even
that
debated this
reminds me
theory
of,
at length with Dr. Eastman. Did Dr. Eastman ever tell you what he thought the U.S.
Vinny.
Supreme Court would do?
Does the Vince case hold any water?
Yes.
Or the prosecution?
We had an extended discussion, an hour and a half to 2 hours on January 5th. And when I pressed him on the point, I said, John, if the Vice President did what you were asking him to do, we would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court, wouldn't we? And he initially started it, well, I think maybe you would lose only 7-2. And after some further discussion, acknowledged, well, yeah, you're right, we would lose 9-0.
I appreciate that. In our investigation, the Select Committee has obtained evidence suggesting that Dr. Eastman never really believed his own theory. Let me explain. On the screen, you can see a draft letter to the President from October 2020. In this letter, an idea was proposed that the Vice President could determine which electors to count at the joint session of Congress. But the person writing in blue eviscerates that argument. The person who wrote the comments in the passive voice that the votes shall then be counted. The comments in blue further state, nowhere does it suggest that the President of the Senate gets to make the determination on his own.
He's not making a decision.
Does it surprise you that the author of those comments in blue was in fact John Eastman?
Yes, it does, Congressman. But let me, watching this unfold, let me try to unpack.
What's up, Raw?
What was at the root.
Discord's open if you want to join it.
Of what I have called the blueprint to overturn the 2020 election. And it is this. And I had foreshadowed this answer in my earlier testimony to Congresswoman Cheney. Mr. Eastman, from the beginning, said to the President that there was both legal as well as historical precedent. I believe is what happened within the White House and elsewhere as all the players led by Mr. Eastman got wrapped around the axle by the historical evidence claim by Mr. Eastman. Let me explain very simply. This is what I said would require a digression that I would be glad to undertake if you wished. In short, if I had been advising the Vice President of the United States on January 6th,
but you weren't.
And even if then Vice President Jefferson.
He's practiced his speech, so he's just remembering his speech word for word, and it's a practice. He practiced this, is what happened.
I would have laid my body historical precedent. But what this body needs to know, and now America needs to know, planned in the years and with the vice presidents that I named, as Congressman Raskin understands well, a single pristine sentence in the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
You can't even say the word pristine.
Taking advantage of, if you will, wording of that sentence before 20 to argue not that Vice President Pence could overturn the 2020 election by accepting non-certified state electoral votes. But they would have made arguments nearly this is constitutional mischief.
Judge, I think that's a good point, and I think it kind of begs the question that if the vice president had this power to determine the outcome of a presidential election, why hasn't it ever been used before? Why hasn't that ever happened? Why hasn't a vice president simply rejected the outcome of an election and declared someone else the winner? And instead, as the chairman mentioned in his opening, for over 2 centuries, vice presidents have presided over the joint sessions of Congress in a purely ceremonial role. This even includes election came down. Of course, Al Gore was vice president at the time, but he never suggested that he could simply declare himself the winner of the 2000 election when he presided over the counting of the electoral votes.
Yeah, well, Al Gore got screwed over,
Vice President Gore said when he described the situation he faced in 2000.
Importance of the United States of America in all of human history. In Lincoln's phrase, we still are the last best hope of humankind. And the choice between one's own disappointment in your personal career and upholding the noble traditions of America's democracy is a pretty easy choice when it comes down to it.
Mr. Jacob, did Dr. Eastman say whether he would want other vice presidents such as Al Gore after the 2000 election or Kamala Harris after the 2024 election to have the power to decide the outcome of the election?
Did he just say come
So this was one, John, back in 2000.
Hold on, I gotta pause
this.
jumping
up and saying.
Hold on, did you just hear that? He just gave away who they're gonna be voting for. Let's see, let me back it up a little bit.
Of the election. Other vice presidents such as Al Gore after the 2000 election or Kamala Harris after
the vice president stuff. Never mind, my bad.
I hope Republicans will win the election, and I know you hope that too, John. And he said, absolutely, but I think you should do it today.
Mr. Short, here is
Donnie's
Mr.
trying because he knows they're lying.
His conversation with Speaker Ryan.
Speaker Ryan wanted to call and say, you know, you don't have any greater authority. And I said to him, Mr. Speaker, you know, Mike, you know he doesn't, you know he recognizes that. And we sort of laughed about it, and he said, I get it. And he later spoke to the vice president, too, to, I think, have the same conversation.
Fortunately, for the fate of our republic, Vice President Pence refused to go along with President Trump's demands that he determine the outcome of the presidential election.
That's not what he wanted.
Mr. Jacob, what was the vice president's reaction when you discussed with him the theory that the vice president could decide the outcome?
Was that there was no way that any one person, particularly the vice president who is on the ticket and has a vested outcome in the election, could possibly have the authority to decide it by rejecting electors or to decisively alter the outcome by suspending the joint session for the first time in history in order to try to get a different outcome from state legislatures.
Despite the fact that the vice president had a strongly held and correct view that he could not decide the outcome of the election, pressure to get the Vice President Mike Pence, President faced from all sides. and what his chief of staff thought of it.
I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
Was it your impression that the vice president had a colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And had been consistent in conveying his position to the president.
Are we to be a nice way to say,
I think the vice.
because Lou, like I said before, elected officials were. Did they vote for the rule of law in this election?
The attention was on what Mike would do or what Mike wouldn't do.
The vice president really was not wavering in his commitment to what his responsibility was. And so, yeah, was it painful? Sure.
The president retweeted a memo from an individual named Ivan Reichland entitled Operation Pence Card that called on the vice president to refuse the Electoral College votes from certain states that December. The testimony we have received in our investigation indicates that by the time January 4th arrived, President Trump had already engaged in a, quote, multi-week campaign to pressure the vice president to decide the outcome of the election. This had included private conversations between the two leaders, Trump's tweets, and at least one meeting with members of Congress. We understand that the vice president started his day on January 4th with a rally in Georgia for the Republican candidates in the U.S. Senate runoff. When the vice president returned to Washington, he was summoned to meet with the president regarding the upcoming joint session of Congress. Mr. Jacob, who attended that meeting?
The attendees were the vice president, the president, Mark Short, the chief of staff to the vice president, myself, and John Eastman. There was about a 5-minute period where Mark Meadows came in on a different issue.
Let's show a photo of that meeting. Mr. Jacob, during that meeting between the president and the vice president, what theories did Dr. Eastman present regarding the role of the vice president in counting the electoral votes?
During the meeting on January 4th, Mr. Eastman was opining that there were 2 legally viable arguments as to authorities that the vice president could exercise 2 days later on January 6th. One of them was that he could reject electoral votes outright. The other was that he could use his 10-day recess.
Nothing wrong with that.
During which the president could sort of issue a demand to the state legislatures in those states to outright, because he thought that that would be less politically palatable. The imprimatur of state legislature authority would be necessary to ultimately have public acceptance of an outcome in favor of President Trump. And so he advocated that the preferred course of action would be the procedural route of suspending the joint session and sending the election back to the states.
Mr. Jacob, I know you won't discuss the direct conversations between the president and the vice president, so rather than asking you what the vice president said in that meeting, I'll ask you a more general question. Did the vice president ever waver in his position that he could not unilaterally decide which electors to accept?
The vice president never budged from the position that I have described as his first instinct, which was that it just made no sense from everything that he knew.
Vacation and send it back to the states.
No, he did not.
Did Dr. Eastman admit in front of the president that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count Act?
So during that meeting on the 4th, I think I raised, Mr. Eastman acknowledged that that was the case, that even what he viewed as the more politically palatable option would violate several provisions. But he thought that we could do so because in his view, the Electoral Count Act was unconstitutional. And when I raised concerns that that position would likely lose in court, his view was that the court simply wouldn't get involved. They would invoke the political question doctrine, and therefore we could have some comfort proceeding with that path.
Mr. Wood?
But just to reiterate, he told you, maybe this was in a later conversation, but he told you at some point that if in fact the issue ever got to the Supreme Court, his theory would lose 9-0, correct?
The next morning, starting around 11 or 11:30, we met for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And in that meeting, I've already described the text, structure, history conversation, but we started walking through all of that. And I said, so John, basically what you have is want that to be the rule. Wouldn't we lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court? And again, he initially started, well, maybe you'd only lose.
In the United States, President Trump continued to publicly pressure Vice President Pence in his Georgia speech. Rather than focusing exclusively on the Georgia Senate runoff, Trump.
Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great Vice President comes through for us. He's a great guy.
They've shown this video how many times
if he
now?
doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
How many times are they going to show that video?
So the president had been told multiple times that the vice president could not affect the outcome of the election, but he nonetheless publicly pressured Mike Pence to do exactly that by saying, quote, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him as much.
It's a
Let's
joke.
turn now to January 5th. Mr. Wood?
Oh my gosh.
Or to reject electors. Let's reject fraud January 4th, and you briefed a meeting with Dr. Eastman on
with it. Mark Short had and that meeting went for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. Chief of Staff Mark Short was, what most surprised me about that meeting was that when Mr. Eastman came in, he said, I'm here to request that you reject the electors. So on the 4th, that had been the path that he had said, I'm not recommending that you do that. But on the 5th, heading into the meeting, I didn't hear much new from him to record, but that was the first thing I recorded in my notes was request that the VP reject.
Just to be clear, you're saying that Dr. Eastman urged the vice president to adopt the very same approach, requesting VP reject January 5th.
Yes, view, and I actually had spent the specific provisions of the election pushing the sort of robust unilateral power theory. I've already walked the committee through the discussions that we had. I started out with our points of commonality, or what I thought were our points of commonality. We're conservatives, we're small government people, we believe in originalism as the means by which we're going to interpret this. And so we walked through the text, we walked through the history, and the committee had shown footage of Mr. Eastman on the stage on the 6th claiming that Jefferson at all effect with the certificate in Georgia, that he had any authority to reject electors. He didn't do that. And so he acknowledged by the end that supported his position. He had initially tried to, we've covered, he acknowledged it would lose 9 minutes. They'll invoke have the 10 days for the states to weigh in and resolve it. And then they'll.
Uh-oh. We're freezing.
Be able to, this was a political question. Among other things, if the courts did not step in to resolve the standoff between the president, we've exercised authorities that constitutionally we think we have by which we have deemed ourselves the winners of the election. You would have an opposed House and Senate disagreeing with that. You would have state legislatures that, to that point, I mean, Republican leaders across those legislatures had put out statements, and we collected these for the vice president as well, that the people had spoken in their states and that they had no intention of reversing the outcome of the election. We did receive states, but no state had any legislative house that indicated that it had any interest in it. So you would have had, and politically, it would of the questions, and the vice president jointly have a constitutional commitment to generally decide electoral vote issues. I don't think that they have any authority to object. Agree that this is a terrible idea. And he couldn't quite bring himself to say yes to that, but he very...
You just described it, you even described it as it potentially could be decided in the streets. And you described several concessions that Dr. Eastman made throughout that. Eastman seemed to, the theory that the vice president to admit that both of these theories...
At least one, we really were focused because his request that he made had been reject the electors outright on why that theory was wrong and why we certainly would not be doing that. Later that day, he pivoted back to, well, we hear you loud and clear, more prudent course where you could, both Mr. Eastman, graduates of that august and plenary vice presidential authority is what you have to get there. Because this new theory, as I was pointing out to him, or the procedural theory, and the only way that you could ever be that they were parties that were formed to the basis for the legal theory was the same, palatable.
That meeting, according to...
I don't think that the University of Chicago is going to start a Chicago Chickens fundraising club, but yes, that is the weird.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Mr. Jacob, the president and the vice president meet again on that same topic the next day.
And he went down to the Oval Office while Mark and I stayed back in the vice president's office.
You weren't in that meeting.
I was not.
In the book Peril, journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa write that the president said, quote, if these people say you have president respond, I don't see a way to do it. We've exhausted every option. I've done everything I could and then some to find a way around this. It's simply not possible. My interpretation is no. To which the president says, no, no, no. You don't understand, Mike. You can do this. I don't want to be your friend anymore if you don't do this. We asked Mark Short about this during his deposition.
Oh no, I won't be your friend anymore.
In other conversations with the vice president, he articulated to me that...
Mr. Jacob, did you, Mr. Short, and the vice president have a call later that day again with the president and Dr. Eastman?
So, yes, we did.
And what did Dr. Eastman request on that call?
On that phone call, which I believe was around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Mr. Eastman stated that he had heard us loud and clear that morning. We were not going to be rejecting electors. But would we be open to considering the other course that we had discussed on the 4th, which would be to suspend the joint session and request that state legislatures re-examine certification of the electoral votes?
That same day, January 5th, the New York Times ran a story about the disagreement between the president and the vice president about whether the vice president could determine the outcome of the election. Even though the New York Times story was indisputably correct, Donald Trump denied it. Trump issued a statement claiming
you guys keep
the vice
denying the
president
Hunter
had
Biden
agreed
laptop.
that he could determine the outcome of the election, despite the fact that the vice president had consistently rejected that position. Let's look at what the president said in his statement. Quote, the New York Times report regarding comments Vice President Pence supposedly made to the president and I are in total vice president phone call with Trump campaign senior at that call.
Okay, tell me about the conversation you had with Jason.
It was brief. I was irritated at the president's viewpoint without consultation. I think the record shows that that's incorrect.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been through many documents that clarify that this is not where the vice president was.
Right. So essentially, the president's sending out a baldly false statement about being in alignment, purported alignment with the vice president, despite all of the predicate that you indicated had gone before about their respective positions. Is that effectively what happened?
I interpret this statement as false. I'll let you figure out who sent it out.
When Mark Short contacted you, he was upset. Is that what you said?
He clearly was not pleased.
Tell us what he said.
What's the process for putting out a statement for a meeting where only 2 people were in the room.
Did he ask you to retract the statement?
No, I think it went right to what's the process for putting out a statement for a meeting when only 2 people were in the room.
And he clearly disagreed with the substance, though, right? Because he said the vice president doesn't agree with this.
Trying to think what exactly he said. I mean, the tone was very clearly that he used some language to
dictate. He said dictate.
We typically on these, maybe specifically on this one that out was the way that he wanted to.
The dispute between the president and the vice president had grown to the point where the vice president's chief of staff, Mark Short, was concerned that the president could, in Mr. Short's words, quote, lash out at the vice president on January 6th. In fact, Mr. Short was so concerned about it that he talked with the head of the vice president's Secret Service detail on January 5th.
So as these disagreements became more public, that the president would lash out in some way.
After the recess, we will hear that Mark Short's concerns were justified. The vice president was in danger. Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
After the recess? What do I need a recess for?
Pursuant to the order of the committee of today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
I thought it was only supposed to be a 2-hour hearing today.
Chairman Benny Thompson calling for this short break in the hearing. This is live coverage from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. With me is
Let's hear
James
what these idiots
Homan.
are going to say.
James, there's a real question about just what John Eastman understood about the legality of what he, by Mr. Jacob in particular, is he's recounting his memories of the conversations. Let's talk about this question of the legality of what Eastman was pushing in terms of the vice president's role.
Well, if you take Greg Jacobs' word, he knew there'd be back and forth between asking him to just reject the Biden electors outright from Arizona and Georgia to asking the vice president to suspend or call a recess for 10 days to send the vote back to the states. He acknowledged that in Greg Jacobs telling that this would likely lead to violence in the streets, and in one of the more bombshell moments of that gripping testimony, Eastman allegedly said that there have been times in American history, also acknowledged in Jacob 100 precedent of Thomas Jefferson supposedly ruling that he had won Georgia, that actually didn't work to support his argument. So what we see from that sworn testimony, Libby, is that John Eastman knew that his document him to do what he was calling for in an early was coordinating with Trump to essentially stage what would be an attempted coup, knowing that that they had lost the election, knowing that the argument didn't carry water, but still that he had this.
And we don't have lines are what the vice. But then there's stood this to be an illegal attempt. Then it gets to the question of motive and why they would keep pushing and what they're trying to accomplish.
Watch while we're waiting for them to come
if they don't really believe or put weight into this legal avenue.
Yeah, and it's not just Eastman. We also heard the video clip of Eric Hirschman, who was a White House lawyer, who said that on the morning of January 6th, he talked with Rudy Giuliani on the phone as he was getting dressed to go into work. And in his sworn testimony, Rudy Giuliani said he understood that the law didn't back them up, that they would certainly lose before the Supreme Court.
But that's
and then the committee played that video of Giuliani the very same day, just a few hours later, saying publicly that that Pence had to what he or die moment, and history was, and everyone of the lawyers inside the White House together gets its state of mind.
Yeah, because that was just a fascinating optic. If you didn't have names attached, you might not even realize it was the same human being, because Jason Miller, part of this team that was down, very somber statement to the committee and talking about sort of the
he's wearing a mask so he can't see his lies
and what they recognized and accepted. But that same person is on TV just completely, like it's like a complete performance, really.
Interviews on Fox
Everything
News
you guys are
not
doing is a
under oath.
performance.
Right.
And that's the difference. You saw during it was a nice little window into how these conversations work, because he knows that he would put himself in legal jeopardy for showing the flippancy that he showed during that Fox News hit.
Yeah, there are two
they're making a tea.
Experiences we're living. One is we're seeing testimony that's totally contradict the iceberg, right? The tiny bit up top and then a lot happening below the surface. And an example of that, of course, is former Attorney General Barr. We saw the little tip of the over the sea of what he was willing to say in public, mostly being very complimentary to President Trump, and we're now seeing in this, these excerpts they've shown earlier this week that he was just agog at some of the legal theories and attempts that the president was trying to make. I want to play one excerpt of what we heard from Greg Jacob today. This is the former counsel to the vice president, and here we see him telling the committee that he had said there was no way the framers of the Constitution would have given so much power to just one person. He advised this to the vice president. Especially, the framers wouldn't have given so much power to a person who would have had the ability to gain from the...
On this question, there's just separated in a way that they would have put in the hands of one person the authority to determine who was going to be president of the United States. And then we went to history. We examined every single electoral vote count that had happened in Congress since the beginning of the country. We examined the Electoral Count Act. We examined practice under the Electoral Count Act. And critically, no vice president in 230 years of history had ever claimed to have that kind of authority, hadn't claimed authority to United States. The crisis of 1876, the decisive to decide anything, and by the way, also does not have authority to conduct an investigation by sending things back out.
Political reporter who writes the 5-Minute Fix newsletter. Amber, let's talk about the significance of this testimony. What's standing out to you today?
Yeah, well, there's advisors to Pence who said one man, as you just pointed out, who has an incentive for who gets to be president.
Seaweed, what is that?
And yet, the committee is just driving home this point that Eastman kept trying and trying and trying and trying, even as they argued he didn't believe what was said. So why is that significant? I'm watching this through the lens of whether the committee may, at the end of this month, say, okay, we referred Trump to the Justice Department for X amount of crimes.
How long have they been on break
One
for
of the
now?
top ones they've been looking at for months raises a separate case about whether the committee could have some of the evidence it's sharing with us
It's been
today.
over 10 minutes already.
In March, a federal judge pointed to this Pence pressure campaign, specifically the stop
Is that bacon?
in the
They're
committee's
deep frying
ability to
bacon?
argue that President Trump may have committed a crime.
So, Amber, one of the things we heard from Jacob is that he says Eastman
That's some
agreed that
weird-looking
Al
ground
Gore
beef.
couldn't have done this, couldn't have just decided to stay in
American cheese.
office. He agreed that Kamala Harris couldn't do
Barbecue
it
sauce
in a
and
couple of
ketchup.
years'
That's barbecue
time.
sauce.
But Jacob said Eastman said they should do it anyway this time around. Why
Yeah,
is that significant?
That bacon
go
needs to be
ahead, go
cooked
ahead.
a little bit longer.
Sure, Jacob seemed, again,
taco.
he's this Pence to change political and nakedly part constitutionality and to us,
Onions
right?
with
We would want
chives.
Democrats to be able to summarize partisan.
And
Sounds like
Amber, we're
they're
going to
back.
cut you off there and go back to the committee hearing room. Thank you so much.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, is recognized.
All right, now I'm going to start cooking me some lunch, guys.
I'd now like to turn to the events of January 6, 2021, which turned out to be a fateful day in our nation's history. Despite the fact that the Vice President consistently told the President that he did not have and would not want the power to decide the outcome of the presidential election, Donald Trump continued to pressure the Vice President, both publicly and privately. As you will hear, things reached a boiling point on January 6th, and the consequences were disastrous. In the middle of the night,
All right, I'm going to go start cooking food up right
into
back,
the
guys.
morning of the 6th, around 1 a.m., President Trump tweeted at the Vice President, meaning that the comments in response to the President's tweet would also show up on the Vice President's Twitter feed. The tweet stated that the Vice President could, quote, come through for us, and send it back to the states. Then around 8 a.m. on January 6th, President Trump again tweeted, this time to say that the vice president could send it back to the states and, quote, we win. And that this is the time for extreme courage. Mr. Meeting on January 6th in prayer. Here is what Mr. Short said.
I recall that knowing it would be an important day, we gathered in prayer, and often noticed. And
Mr. Jacob, did you go to the vice president's residences on the morning of January 6th?
Yes.
Who else was with you?
And we were told that a call had come in from the president. The vice president stepped out of the room to take that call, and no staff went with him.
The president had several family members with him in the Oval before seeing photographs of the president on that call.
When I got in, somebody called me and said that the family and others were in the Oval, and do I want to come up? So
I'm eating lunch right now.
And who do you recall being in the Oval Office?
Don Jr., Eric, Laura, Kimberly, I believe Meadows was there. At some point, Ivanka came in.
There's a time. The president's end.
Only heard the president's end. And at some point, it started off as a calmer tone and everything, and then became heated.
The conversation was pretty heated.
I think till it became somewhat, louder tone. I don't think anyone was paying attention to it initially.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what did you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, you are
Sounds
a wimp,
like something you would
you'll be
say.
a wimp. Wimp is the word I remember.
It's also been reported that the president said to the vice president that
you're not tough enough to make.
Did Ms. Trump share with you any more details about what had happened, or any details about what had happened in the Oval Office that morning?
That her dad,
Either during the meeting or when you encountered her in Dan Scavino's office?
I don't remember specifically. I mean, I think she was uncomfortable over the fact that there was obviously that type of interaction between the two of them.
Something to the effect, the wording's wrong. I made the wrong decision 4 or 5 years ago.
And the word that she relayed to that the president called the vice president.
Mr. Jacob, how would you describe the demeanor of the vice president?
That he was
the most dangerous part.
What are we going to do?
This will be just lips with Vice President Pence.
I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because it's to recertify. And I just spoke to Mike. I said, Mike, that doesn't take courage. What takes courage is to do nothing. That takes courage. And then we're stuck with a president who lost the election by a lot, and we have to live with that for 4 more years. We're just not going to let that happen. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. And they want to recertify their votes.
Notice how they keep cutting it out?
They want to
They don't want to show you the whole thing.
But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do. And I hope he doesn't listen to the rhinos and the stupid people that he's listening to.
Of course, we all know what happened next.
Why did you chop up the video? Why don't
President's
you play the whole
words
video in
had an
full?
effect. President Trump's supporters became angry. When the vice president issued his public letter, the crowd at the Capitol erupted in anger. The rioters who had erected makeshift gallows began chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Testimony in our investigation has made clear what the target of the rioters' ire was: Vice President Mike Pence.
It looked like at the timeline they had already broken into the
Rioters
Capitol.
breached the Capitol at 2:13 p.m.
Oh, that Dominic Pizzola, what a jerk off.
Mr. Meadows, Vice President Pence, for not having, quote, courage to do what needed to be done. Here is what
all this started. It's not going to reject.
See, look, they're already on top of the Capitol. They're already on top of the Capitol. They're already on top of the Capitol, folks.
You heard it here first. Mike Pence has betrayed the president.
Which apparently everybody go back and watch the president's video.
This is our Capitol. Let's be respectful to him. There's 4 million people coming in, so there's a lot of control. We love you guys. We love the cops.
and White House Deputy about the violence. More about exactly what was happening in the White House at that time.
And I followed him hallway and the outer oval section of the oval. I saw him walk into outer oval. I maybe took a step into outer oval and then left. And I don't.
Bad, and the situation was getting out of hand, and I know Ben Williamson and I thought the president needed. Then I remember Roma and Ben. We looked down, and it was a tweet about Mike Pence.
I believe I had sent him a text saying that we may want to put out some sort of statement because the situation was getting a little hairy over at the Capitol. And then it was common for, after I would text him, I would just go down and see him in person.
You went down to speak with Mark Meadows.
Same thing I have in the text that I can recall. And I don't remember anything that was said between us other than I told him that. And to my recollection, he immediately got up and left his office.
Inside the Capitol was quickly evacuated from his ceremonial Senate office to a secure location within
Donnie.
the Capitol complex.
Mike Pence didn't have the courage to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth.
It was clear that it was escalating and escalating quickly. I remember us saying that was the last that was pouring gasoline on the fire.
Just down the hall.
Secret Service couldn't control
Man,
the
they're
situation.
I think they've been trying to figure.
We moved pretty quickly down the stairs and through various hallways and tunnels to the secure location. Upon arriving
Yeah, Richard,
there
I
was
can't
further
restream
discussions
other
to whether
people
or
like
not we
that.
were
That's
going
their
to
own.
leave the Capitol complex or stay where we were.
I don't like doing stuff
Vice
like that.
President Pence and his team ultimately were led to a secure location where they stayed for the next 4.5 hours, barely missing rioters a few feet away.
How close the mob was to the evacuation route that you took? The 40 feet is the distance from me to you, roughly.
I could hear the...
Would have killed members to as W1 stated that other members of the group talked about things they did that day, and they said that anyone they got their hands on, they would have killed,
baloney.
including Nancy Pelosi.
Baloney.
W1 further stated that members of the Proud Boys said that they would have killed
Here's the
Mike
problem,
Pence
folks.
if given a chance.
This person is a confidential witness. Well, you know what? That's that's why they're confidential, because they're not saying their real. They're not going to say their name. This is baloney. They're lying.
We understand that congressional leaders and others were evacuated from the Capitol complex during the attack. We'd like to show you what happened after the Vice President was evacuated from the Senate.
Select Committee has obtained never-before-seen photos from the National Archives that show Vice President Pence sheltering in a secure underground location as rioters overwhelmed the Capitol. At 4:19 p.m., Vice President Pence is seen looking at a tweet the President had just sent, a tweet asking the rioters to leave the Capitol. After 4.5 hours, spent on working to restore order.
So Vice President Pence was a focus
Nothing I can do about that.
of the violent attack. Mr. Jacob, did the Vice President leave the Capitol complex during the attack?
He did not.
Can you please explain why the Vice President refused to leave the Capitol complex?
When we got down to the secure location, the Secret Service directed us to get into the cars, which I did. And then I noticed that the Vice President had not. So I got out of the car that I had gotten into, and I understood that the Vice President had refused to get into the car. The head of his Secret Service detail, Tim, had said, "I assure you we're not going to drive out of the building without your permission." And the Vice President had said something to the effect of, "Tim, I know you, I trust you, but you're not the one behind the wheel." And the Vice President did not want to take any chance that the world would see the Vice President of the United States fleeing the United States Capitol. He was determined that we would complete the work that we had set out to do that day, that it was his constitutional duty to see through, and that the rioters who had breached the Capitol would not have the satisfaction.
Cars, while he did not.
Most of us.
During our investigation, we received testimony that the Vice President reached out to congressional leaders, like the Acting Secretary of Defense and others, to check on their safety and to address the growing crisis. In addition, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, Mark Short, made several calls to senior government officials. Here's Mr. Short's testimony regarding.
I don't know why it's buffering so much.
While the Vice President made several calls to check on the safety of others, it was his own life that was. Mr. Jacob.
Mr. Jacob, immediately before you and the Vice President were evacuated to a secure location within the Capitol, you hit send on an email to John Eastman explaining why his legal theory about the Vice President's role in a public way so the American people can see for themselves what happened. Mr. Jacob, later that day you wrote again to Dr. Eastman. You wrote, "Have the power to decide things unilaterally."
That's what they weren't. That's not what they were asking for.
It does not appear that the President ever got the memo. He ends his quote. Mr. Jacob, when Dr. Eastman wrote, "Once he gets something in his head, it's hard to get him to change course," did you understand the he in that email to refer to the President of the United States?
I did.
And Mr. Jacob, did you hear from Dr. Eastman further?
Saying that violence was not going to win, freedom wins, and that the people were going to get back to doing their work. Later that evening, Mr. Eastman emailed me to point out that in his view, the Vice President's, that the Electoral Count Act had been violated because the debate on Arizona had not been completed in 2 hours. Of course, it couldn't be since there was an intervening riot of several hours. And that the speeches that the majority and minority leaders had been allowed to make also violated the Electoral Count Act. Suspend the joint session, send it back to the states.
And we'll show you the text of that email, which Dr. Eastman wrote at 11:44 p.m. on January 6th. So after the attack on the Capitol and after law enforcement had secured the Capitol, he still wrote, as you described, quote, "So now that the precedent has been set that the Electoral Count Act is not quite so sacrosanct as was and adjourned will have been quelled, Dr. laying the certification and sending the question back to the..."
At that time, because the Vice President was completing the work that it was his duty to do, but a day or two later, back at the White House, I did show him that final email from Mr. Eastman.
And what was Vice President Pence's and send it back to the states?
It's rubber.
After having seen play out, convince people that he was still pushing us to do what he had been asking us to do for the previous 2 days, that was certifiably crazy.
We know that the Vice President did not do what Dr. Eastman requested because he presided over the completion of the counting of electoral votes late in that evening.
The number of electors appointed President of the United States are as follows.
Joseph R. Biden Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes. The whole number of electors appointed, the vote 106 votes. Michael R. Pence of the state of Indiana has received 232 votes. The announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for the term beginning on the 20th day of January, 2021.
You faced a lot of danger that day, and this is a personal question. But how did your faith guide you on January 6th?
Was where I went.
Let's see the
second in command of Babylon, a pagan nation, but he completely faithfully serves. He refuses an order from the king that he cannot follow, and he does his duty consistent with his. Yes.
I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I've kept the faith.
White House attorney Eric Hirschman testified that the next day, January 7th, he received a call from Dr. Eastman. Here is Mr. Hirschman's account of that call.
The day after, he called me, wanted to talk with me, and he said he couldn't reach others. And he started to, and I said to him, "Are you out of your effing mind?" Right? I said, I only want to hear two words coming out of your mouth from now on. Orderly transition. And I screamed, I said, I don't want to hear any other. And I screamed another second. Eventually he said, orderly transition. I said, good, John. Now I'm going to give you the best free legal advice you're ever getting in your life. Get a great effing criminal defense lawyer. You're going to need it. And then I hung up on him.
And requested that he be included on a list of potential recipients of a presidential pardon. Dr. Eastman's email stated, quote, I've decided that I should be on the pardon list, if that is still in the works. Dr. Eastman did not receive his presidential pardon. So let's see what Dr. Eastman did as a result when he was deposed by this.
Did the Trump list on January 6, 2020? Yeah. From 7 states, the memo. Is that statement publicly your January 4th, 2021 conversation with him?
Fifth.
That's what I would do. You say the Fifth Amendment all the time.
Discuss those same conversations with this committee.
Fifth.
Dr. Eastman pled the Fifth 100 times. Finally, let's hear from a federal court judge.
What's wrong with that?
To date, who has opined on whether the president was in January 6, 2021. Page 40 of the ruling says, quote, based on the evidence, the court finds that it is more likely than not that President Trump and Dr. Eastman dishonestly conspired to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. It was a coup in search of a legal theory. Mr. Jacob, what would have happened to our democracy if Vice President Pence had gone along with this plan and certified Donald Trump as the winner of the 2020 election?
Described a constitutional, just what happening in the streets, and you would have had the Vice President of the United States having declared that the outcomes of these state elections were incorrect. So for all of those reasons, there would have been significant short-term consequences. But in the long term, we would have established a situation where a vice president would have asserted that one person could have the authority to determine the outcome of an election, which is antithetical to everything in our democracy. It's antithetical to the rule of law. And so,
Judge Reckless?
Exactly what I said, Congressman.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Mr. Jacob. Mr. Chairman,
Man, hopefully they're done now.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I want that back.
He's a liar.
Mr. Chairman, this was an informative hearing, a powerful hearing. I'm grateful for your leadership and the leadership of the distinguished Vice Chair. Donald Trump knew he lost the 2020 election, but he could not bring himself to participate in the peaceful transfer of power. So he latched on to a scheme that, once again, he knew was illegal. And when the Vice President refused to go along with it, he unleashed the country. It cannot be allowed to continue. I'll yield back now, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to my colleague, Representative Aguilar, and thank you very much to our witnesses today, Mr. Jacob and Judge Ludig. Thank you for being here with us. We have seen so far in our hearings that President Trump knew that his claims of a stolen election, what President Trump did to pressure Mike. You will see information about President Trump's efforts, John Eastman efforts, the Trump legal team's efforts to apply pressure to Republican state legislatures, state officials, and others. Judge Carter has recently written, quote, Dr. Eastman's actions in these few counts did not end with Vice President Pence. We will examine all of those threats, and we will examine the Trump team's determination to transmit materially false electoral slates from multiple states to officials of the executive and legislative branches of our government. We will examine an honorable man receiving, a man who loved his country more than himself, would have conceded this election. Indeed, we know that a number of presidents.
Judge Ludig, and your loyalty to our Constitution. You and Vice President Pence are exactly the people our nation needed at a critical time. You had the courage to do what was right. In the weeks leading up to January 6th, or the demands of Donald Trump. But there were others who, like you, stood tall in the face of intimidation and put our democracy first. They include the judges who rejected the bogus claims of election fraud, the senior Justice Department officials who stood up to Donald Trump, and the state officials whom we will hear from at our next hearing. We are deeply grateful to your courage and devotion to our country. There are some who think the danger of overturn the presidential election failed and our democratic foundation destroyed. But for people like
Judy?
You, Judge Ludig, I want to give you an opportunity to share your thoughts on the ongoing threat. You've written the clear and present danger to our democracy. Now is that former President Donald Trump and other political allies appear candidates is not elected by the American people. What do you mean by this?
Mr. Chairman, I'm honored beyond words by your words. I was honored on Vice President Mike Pence. I prayed that day, just like the Vice President prayed that day. I believe we may have prayed the same prayer to the same God. I have written, as you said, Chairman Thompson, that today, almost 2 years after that fateful day in January 2021, that still Donald Trump and are a clear and present danger to American democracy. That's not because of what happened on January 6th. It's because to this very day, the former president, his allies and supporters play election of 2024 if the former president or his anointed successor as the Republican Party
This guy is so slow, it's driving me nuts.
were to lose that election, attempt to overturn that they attempted but succeed. I don't speak those words lightly. I would have never spoken those words ever in my life, except that that's what the former president and his allies are telling us. As I said in that New York Times op-ed, wherein I was speaking about the Electoral Count Act of 1887, the former president and his allies are executing that blueprint for 2024 in open and plain view of the American public. One of those words to America. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear here today for these proceedings.
Thank you again, Judge Ludick. As a part of the Select Committee's charge to make recommendations that are informed by other investigative findings, we will be reviewing the views shared by Judge Ludick and other experts. Among is shocking. The idea to stay in power because so many witnesses direct us about cooperating in it in our hearings and find a tip
Why don't you show all the evidence
to
you've been
submit any information you might think would be helpful for our investigation. And despite how you might not think it's important, send us what you think. And I thank those who sent us evidence for their bravery and patriotism. Without remarks and additional questions for the witnesses, the chair requests those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members from the room. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
All right, guys. Thank you for being here. I'm actually going to stop it right here because I found out some ways maybe to speed this up so we don't have issues of buffering anymore. So I'm going to try that out. I'm going to work on that before tonight's show. But come on back tonight, 6 o'clock Pacific time, and we'll have another show. Have a good day, folks. See you later on.